Thank you, Sue, and hello everybody. As Sue said, my name is Mike Ford. A little bit of background about myself. I initially started in the field of health and safety in the early 90s and progressed into the area of ethical sourcing, human rights in the early 2000s. Interestingly enough, I moved into this field when social audits were just starting to gather some traction, and we know there's a little bit of a hung jury around social auditing as to whether it's effective or not. I'm kind of from the school where if they're delivered properly and delivered effectively, then they contain a lot of value and provide the client with transparency. We're now starting to see an awful lot of organizations focusing around ESG and sustainability, and many are seeing the issue and use of social auditing as a valuable tool to identify potential risks within their direct and indirect supply chains. So what we'd like to try and do here is, in this particular brief time that we've got together, with the use and increase of social auditing or social and ethical auditing, very often that they're starting to land in the lap of the safety professional based in-house, or you may bring in a third-party consultant to help you deliver the audit. What we want to try and do is share some of the things that the social auditor will be looking for, because these aren't things that you can pick up in a classroom. So to try and understand what is it they're looking for, because this is a move away from the traditional compliance audit, the ISO 14001, the ISO 9001, and so on. It is a very, very different type of audit. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce an old colleague, Jim Lung. If you could just please give us a brief introduction to yourself, Jim, we'll crack on.
Thanks, Mike. Very pleased to be with you and being able to share some of the experiences that I've accumulated over the years. So just to give the audience a very brief introduction of myself. I'm based in the UK now, newly retired, fortunately. Spent the first half of my career in UK retail, working for the likes of Marks & Spencer, Sainsbury's and Mothercare, on the product technology side and quality assurance side, before heading out to the Far East, Hong Kong, which is where place of my parents' birth. And spent the latter half of my career there, primarily working for the Walt Disney Company. Was in a corporate environment, corporate function. And at that time, we called it corporate social responsibility, CSR. Was looking after what we call the International Labour Standards Program. That's what we called it within Disney, where it's basically this social compliance program responsible for managing a team of about 55 people in 8 locations around Asia. And we had the remit of applying the corporate program to all entities that were involved with handling Disney intellectual property. So it would be licensees, it would be factories making Disney merchandise for licensees, not necessarily for Disney, but for licensees. It could be factories producing items or components, recognizable components for Disney itself. So it was quite broad, and yeah, that was a program that I've been going since '96. I joined them in 2000 and spent 17 years with them.
Perfect, thank you. So we're going to start this with a pretty wide question, Jim, because the scope of these particular audit programs tend to be based around a code of conduct, whether that be Ethical Trade Initiative based code, United Nations Global Compact, GRI, SGE 21, and so on. And even some industries have their own codes of conduct, so concrete and cement, GCCA, etc. And in many cases, the codes of conduct can sometimes have higher requirements than the legislation within that country of operation. And so the management systems that very often land in the lap of the safety professional, and they have to develop, especially around supplier management, contractor management, etc. Where do you start just to ensure that your management systems can be seen to actually dovetail into these code requirements?
Mm-hmm. I would say the stuff, as I said to other people, don't start because you've just been smacked in the face by an issue associated with social compliance in your supply chain. It's you don't want to wait for that to happen because it's quite painful, and you might head off down the wrong track, spend and waste money going down the wrong track. But it's a difficult start, and codes are, most of the codes are very similar, and they've derived from the ILO's fundamental principles. There are 8 conventions that they've put out there around forced labour, minimum age, child labour, freedom of association. But in addition to that, there are other codes that a brand or a customer would write and apply, which are maybe more specific to the customer or the brand or the owner of the code of conduct. So, as I said, when I was out there doing my stuff, 90% of the codes were very similar. And there'd be maybe 10% would be very, very specific to that particular brand, whether it be certain levels of sensitivity associated with certain industries. Now, the key element is the code application, or what we would call the audit protocol. What determines whether something gets written up, something gets identified as a violation or not. Now, we know that the ILO's conventions haven't been signed up by every single country. So that's why within each country, there are always some specific variations. While the minimum working age for young people, it differs from country to country. Why the working hours may differ. Freedom of association in the second largest economy in the world is quite a tall order to achieve, full freedom of association. So there are things, some grey areas which are quite difficult to navigate. But I would say the code is a code. Don't get too worried about it. Maybe not reinvent your own code. Look at what's out there that's relevant to your own industry, and then understand what the second level is, which is to really understand how that code is being applied. There are some organizations that have a pass-fail mentality, depending on what the severity of the finding is. There are others that have well, we'll just write it up and we'd like to see improvement over time, a continuous improvement program with fixed milestones. So it's one of the key things really is, as an organization, having a good awareness as to what your strategy is and what your brand is, or what your values are, having that lined up with really what your customers are asking you to do. There's no point in having a customer who has a very high standard and then having another customer with no standard, because the two are going to come at odds. You're going to make products more expensive for a customer that doesn't care versus a customer that really cares. So you may have to find that, you find some adjustment that where your strategy is one that identifies who are your strategic customers and your partners that you want to deliver 100% on. So obviously expertise is important. I would say there's plenty of stuff out there, plenty of experts out there. Don't reinvent the wheel, and see whether there are any industry initiatives that an organization could join or could certainly learn from.
What a granular challenge that I'd flag up and like your view on, Jim, is, and something that I used to see was very often many people interpret the requirements of the code in terms of responsible sourcing as being HR issues. But the reality is some of these HR issues have a very high probability of becoming a safety related issue, whether that's using underage workers or using workers that don't have first language or have literacy or are being subject to forced labor, etc. I used to find this an awful lot, and the safety person I would say the recipient was, well, that belongs to HR. How can we try, and again, this is a really open question before we get into the real meat and potatoes, but is this something that you found where there's been a real lack of working in tandem with different departments, and some would only say, well, I only do this and that belongs to another department, and they can't see that from a responsible sourcing aspect, the two are dovetailed and married together?
Yeah, No, you're absolutely right. There is you often see that where it's passing the buck, basically. Is it a HR problem, or is it somebody else? Is it an admin finance department's problem for not paying the wages on time, or is it production's problem for actually accepting an order that, or sales for selling stuff that the factory or the production unit can't produce in time, or production, they don't have the equipment, they don't have the capacity. So to me, it's all interconnected, and really the ownership resides with the management and the ownership of the organization that's involved here. The passing the buck, easy to do, right? But it's not going to solve anything, and it doesn't solve the overall issue of, here is a set of customer requirements, not just on the quality, not just on the product aesthetics, not just on the delivery and the service, but also on the way that the products have been made, the environment that the products have been made. Is it in a safe environment? You know, nobody wants to hear about workers getting injured. Nobody wants workers getting injured for the production of your products. So I think organizations have to have a more holistic approach, which is, it is the responsibility of everybody to call out some of the shortfalls in any manufacturing system or any manufacturing environment, that helps the organization get to a better standard and get to a better level and reduce the risk of falling short of issues and falling short of performance. You know, things like, you know, having zero defects on the quality side that we used to talk about in days gone by. You know, we want zero health issues, you know, and at the same time we want a high level of compliance, but not necessarily saying 100% compliance. I think the practitioners in the industry would say, well, good luck on that one. It's an aspiration, but at least a high level of compliance and a level of compliance, a level of functionality within your manufacturing system that you actually have a good level of control. You know what you're doing.
Right. So if anyone who's listening is not familiar with receiving or is pending a social and ethical audit, there's three basic areas that the safety professional tends to get involved with. That's review of management systems, site inspections, and inspections of accommodation provided and used by workers. That latter doesn't always apply to the UK, but we know in certain sectors, whether that be agriculture, some of the food processing sectors, some of the larger labour agencies provide this. This may fall under the scope of the audit. So looking at the site inspection, this is going to be very different to what the traditional safety individual look at in terms of their site inspection. So the auditor and who's doing this audit is on site for a very limited period of time. So can you just kind of take us through what that auditor is going to be looking for in this brief window of time, and what are the kind of things that they will flag as part of the scope of the audit? Yeah,
I mean, you've highlighted the limitations. I'm not saying that negatively, but fundamental limitations of a health and safety as practitioner in a manufacturing environment, being able to look at certain things within their skill set, and that fundamentally is important because it really does address some of the key issues and the code elements that are fundamentally important to be compliant. I mean, for a social compliance auditor, additionally, they'd be looking at documentation. So they'll be looking at ledgers, payroll ledgers, they'll be looking at time cards, they'll be looking at employment records, they'll be looking at certification to make sure that the factory is legal and has the right permits to be able to operate, and you know, things like discharge of effluent or of waste materials. And then fundamentally, they'll be looking at interviewing workers. Now, so that's on the social compliance auditor side. On the health and safety side, if you're a health and safety practitioner, the things that you're doing is fundamentally important for actually keeping the factory to a reasonable level of compliance in those areas that you're looking at. So health and safety is the number one finding, not necessarily in terms of severity, but always the number one finding in terms of volume of violations that I see or saw with my team in Asia. And yeah, it was a big one. Working hours was another big one, but that's, I would say, is outside the scope of a health and safety practitioner. Accommodation, fundamentally important. I mean, if you find that there's accommodation that's in the warehouse or on top of the factory, it's an issue. There may be some jurisdictions that would allow it, but I think there are many that do not allow it because of the health and safety risks associated with having accommodation in a manufacturing environment, in manufacturing location or building. The hygiene standards are often overlooked, and some of the practices that go on. If you're in a dormitory, typically the hygiene standards are not particularly good. Dormitory of 6, 8, 10 people, and there are some I call them illegal cooking facilities in there because people want to cook up. They're on the night shift, they're finished, and then they just want to have something to eat. Well, there's a gas burner in their dorm or in their room, and there shouldn't be, because it's not legal. So there are those kind of things like staircase or stairwells, entry exit points, emergency exit points, things like the banisters, the height of the banisters or the retaining wall on balconies, as an example. Quite a different standard between the UK and Asia, which seems to be quite low.
Things like CCTV and security, Jim? I mean,
yeah.
If they're doing the site inspection, what do they look at when they're looking at things like CCTV, changing facilities, especially if there's security involved in that as well? What are the kind of things that during the site inspection that the auditor would be possibly looking at around those kinds of things?
So certainly, obviously CCTV, there is obviously privacy is important, and we wouldn't expect CCTV in private areas. Public areas, fair enough, in terms of corridors, that's fine. The open areas, the communal areas, the gate entry up to the dorm, we'd expect that. In terms of the other subject you were talking about was the area of
the security.
Sorry, security. Yeah, sorry, I was going ahead of myself then. So in the areas of security, would be making sure that these security staff were appropriately trained. I mean, it's surprising how untrained they are and how much they can get a factory into trouble by being a little bit over enthusiastic with the way that they apply security. There are things like, to try and combat potential theft, there'd be pat downs, and sometimes you've got to make sure it's the same gender. You've got to make sure that it's not aggressive and it's not excessively targeted or not discriminatory. Not an opportunist for the security guard to do something wrong. He's got to be mindful of his behaviour to the employees rather than acting as a guard. He's there as a service to the factory to make sure that the workers are also safe as well. In terms of making sure that strangers don't walk in, and not just about looking after the assets of the factory management. The workers are there, and they need to be looked after as well.
Right. And one of the things that we've seen within recent years is the use now of photographs of, especially around safety non-compliances. And sometimes we've had sites who will refuse that and also refuse access to certain parts of the facility. If a site refuses an auditor access, can you just give an example of what the potential consequences from the client perspective would possibly be?
Yeah. So you mentioned photography. So we would always ask, an auditor should always ask whether they can take photographs, and then it's up to the factory to say, well, yeah, you can take it here, there, or everywhere, or there are certain specific areas where you can't because of intellectual property protection, or some secret formula or something else. So long as it was a reasonable response to prevention of photography, we would typically respect that. But in terms of, if we used to get factories that played hardball, and either because our business was not meaningful or because they just felt like they could, and they didn't see the need to comply because they just had an audit last week and they're just fed up with yet another audit coming through this week, and as far as they're concerned, they're in compliance. But the implications are it could be, well, probably will be written up as, say, a partial access denied. So it's not a full-blown failure, although that could be for some organisations. They may see it like that, but we see it as a partial access denied. We write down the reason why there was an access denied, whether it be maybe the records or access to part of the factory, and we'd leave it to the decision makers to then make a determination as to how to proceed, whether it would be, okay, let's call in the factory, let's have a chat with them, let's understand what their concerns are, and then typically we could give them another opportunity or another audit to be able to look at it. Sometimes it may be a case of you have to sign a non-disclosure agreement to say, okay, we're going to look at some very sensitive intellectual property, or the auditors are, and therefore we don't want this escaping or going into the public. So therefore, we need a confidentiality agreement signed or non-disclosure agreement signed. So things like that. So we're always trying to look for a way forward based on a rational discussion. If it's irrational and it was very defensive, then we'd probably be wasting our time.
Right. One of the big differences between this type of audit, Jim, and the traditional style of ISO audit is the categories of findings. So can we explain to the audience that the types of findings and how those findings are derived based on either compliance with legislation or compliance with code, or maybe non-compliance with code but complies with legislation? Because we know sometimes the code and the legislation don't always talk to each other. So what are the types of findings that these audits would have?
Yeah. So in terms of code, you've got legislation, and typically whichever is the tighter of the two would apply. So as an example, we used to come into lots of discussions and arguments about working hours in Thailand. 84 working hours, code says 60, maybe 72 at a push for peak times, but that's what we held factories to in Thailand, and they would complain, well, the law says 80, we can work up to 84. And I said, well, okay, that's the law, but here, at the end of the day, this is our business, our brand, and this is the deal. This is the order. You know, do you want to comply or do you not want to comply? Do you want to move forward and continue doing business or not? So at the end of the day, it's business. It's a business decision. So it's the tighter of the code or legislation. So in terms of in terms of how we write it up, we would typically have categories. So critical, major, minor would be three kind of examples of the categorization of violations. Critical violation could be underage labor, or we found some forced labor in the factory, or we found some very significant, well, very severe health and safety issues. So that could be deemed as critical, which would trigger a very immediate response from whoever is receiving that audit report. Major typically would be things that need to be prioritized ahead of all the other things that needed to be done. And then there's minor. We often, certainly in Disney, we often we applied something called minimum compliance standard. So that dealt with all the critical. If we found any critical findings, then that is basically a stop sign where they say do not proceed. So those are three typically.
I know some codes now are starting to encourage the use of a positive finding as well, which I think is a good thing, because we can beat people with a big stick, but they may be trying to do something right in other areas. So it does have the ability to make the process a little bit more balanced than perhaps the more traditional style of audit, which is either black or white. So in terms of we talked about inspection, we briefly mentioned the accommodation side. Is there other things that we need to be looking for? Because I know sometimes some companies, they utilize temporary accommodation like caravans and things like, which is what I used to come across an awful lot, conversion of porter cabins. And we find that a lot in some of the industries where it's seasonal. And is there anything else that we can just add just to top the inspection process of that, things we should be looking for, such as smoke alarms, emergency lighting, and so on? Because one of the problems we used to find was that if we didn't secure some of these things, the workers would take the batteries out and use them for other things, especially when they're coming from different countries where their perception perhaps of risk or safety related issues could be very, very different. And that's a challenge in itself for the safety professional, because obviously you're dealing with people coming from different cultures, different backgrounds. Is there anything else that we can kind of add just to close out on the accommodation side that maybe we should be looking for? I'll give an example from one of my experiences. And not all because people think all the bad things happen in Asia, and they don't. I had a case in Scotland where they'd converted shipping containers into accommodation, and shipping containers have locks, but they're only located on one place, and that's on the outside.
Yeah.
And there's no lighting, no nothing. There's no natural lighting or anything. And the individual that who owned the location, the farm, didn't see anything wrong with that. So is there anything that the auditor may be looking for that may not have been considered by the company?
I think the default has got to be the legislation. What the legislation is around accommodation and around temporary accommodation. So as an example, I spent some time on the build out of the Shanghai Disney Resort, Shanghai Disneyland, and that was a piece of 4 square miles, flat ground, and then we built the park on top of it. And you really had to specify the standards associated with what the accommodation should be. And we weren't happy with the local standards, which was pretty rough, basically. And we had to sort of go back to, well, what are the norms? What are the international standards associated with the construction, the accommodation of construction workers? So it's really trying to look at what is available locally, what is, I would say, it could be deemed to be acceptable. Obviously, you've got certain touch points. One is privacy, one is hygiene, one is the security as well. So it's looking at things that help protect your valuable resources, your workers, and also making sure that they are correctly contracted as well. So, you know, if they're shoved 20 in a caravan, then potentially there's an issue there. But, you know, is that what they signed up for? I doubt it.
Yeah, it's interesting because very often, I know from my experience when we were delivering these audits, you know, sometimes things would be the safety person who's been tasked to go around with you was very surprised at some of the findings because they'd never even seen the accommodation before. And some of them were, well, this is HR, and just going back to the other issue, and this is no, because there's a potential safety issue here. You know, whether they're smoking in them, whether they're cooking in them, or whether they're using illegal electric fires that have been condemned. We used to find very often some of them would go to the local council tips and get heaters out of the skips and fix them to try and keep warm. And you've got fire hazards, and these are the kind of things that we as auditors were picking up, and they were really own goals, really, in my mind, that these are things that should have been picked up very, very quickly. There was always issues around fire safety. That was always a big concern of ours, especially in accommodation. And also, especially if you're sourcing internationally, somebody, well, what can we do about it? Well, these things you can do to try and mitigate it. You're never going to change the world, but there's things you can do to put into place to try and identify and demonstrate you've done something.
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't identify, if you don't pick it out, you don't call it out, then nothing gets done. I mean, the employer has some responsibility, even if they're temporary workers. You know, because that responsibility passes through to the agent as well. That is engaged by the manufacturing location. So, you know, it is connected, and so it fundamentally is important to make sure that safe accommodation.
The big issue that we found was PPE, and especially in some of the meat processing sites we worked at, they used to have a thing called hot booting, and that would mean as soon as someone comes off the 12-hour shift, they went straight into the PPE kit of the people who just finished the shift, and it was a real challenge to try and monitor that. And at times the safety folks used to struggle with that, because it was sometimes it was done when they weren't in the business. It could have been happening in the night shifts and things like that. So one of the vital elements of this type of audit is around human rights. So that's forced labor, underage labor in the suppliers who attend the site, and this could be day labor, agency labor, and we know there's all kinds of different initiatives, licensing programs, and so on. We're also seeing a change with the gangmaster labor abuse organization going to be combined into a singular unit now. Can you just share, Jim, some of the traits that and some of the issues that you've identified that you don't always get told in classroom or on e-learning courses that you could potentially spot that might signify issues around the forced labor issue, the underage issue?
Yeah, so forced labor, underage issues is obviously it's a critical issue, and one that crops up quite regularly, surprisingly. It's good now that there are organisations that have the ability to provide support to all parties with regards to, say, something like child labour and also forced labour. In terms of things to look out for, that I mean, there's some organisations you probably have to go to some of the organisations to ask them for some maybe formal training. But the things that we used to train our auditors on were things like, okay, when you go into a factory and you're looking at the workers, what is it? What is the sentiment? Are the workers feeling kind of, have they all got their heads down and they don't look at whoever's walking past them, because that would seem a bit odd. Are they smiling? Are they, is there eye contact that's being made? So yeah, they sort of paint a different picture. Going into a factory, you may say, right, okay, well, why are there so many machines that are not being used? Why are there so many workstations relative to the number of workers? And you may say, well, okay, well, there's an issue here in terms of either, okay, it could be seasonality, fair enough, or it could be something else where some part of the workforce has been told not to come in because an audit is being conducted on the day. It could be a case of, well, okay, if you suspect that, then talk to security, because often security is third party and they're a service provider that is engaged by the factory owners. So you talk to them and say, well, yeah, is anything going on? Is this your off season? Not too many workers, and then often they will divulge something inadvertently, but you can use it not necessarily as absolute factual evidence, but as a good indicator, as a good tip for further investigation to be able to start your process. Alternatively, if you were suspicious early on, you'd have one of your colleagues standing on the back gate as you're walking in the front gate and seeing how many people pile out the back at the start of an audit. So that's another thing that we used to do where we were highly suspicious of a situation relating to a factory. In terms of forced labour, got to look at the contracts, got to interview the workers, got to understand what did they sign up for, and whether and look out for indications of whether they've been coerced as well to tell you to read you the right answers, or to talk to convey the right answers to you, because some workers are briefed and some are actually positively incentivized to tell you the right answers. Unfortunate, but it's a kind of becomes a bit of a game sometimes.
And what about things like, because one of the challenges that a lot of safety professionals face in this country especially is workers coming in with English as a second language. Now, obviously, that could be a problem anywhere. They may be, someone may have migrated from Thailand into China or vice versa and don't understand the local language. Right. One of the challenges that I used to find was that things such as emergency cutoffs, things like that, the things that they really need to know. Yeah. And there was very little testing going on in terms of ensuring the worker actually understood the basic safety requirements. Yeah. As an auditor, that was always something that I could guarantee 9.5 times out of 10, if I wanted to find something, I could find something in that area.
Yeah, So as an
Is that
example,
something you've ever seen before a lot? Did you see that a lot yourself?
No, absolutely. So where there's significant amount of migrant labour, so take the electronics industry in Malaysia. A lot of people are coming from offshore, from other countries, whether it be typically Bangladesh or some of the other South Asian countries, and they make up a big part of the workforce in the electronic industry. So what do you do? As part of your audit scope, you would be understanding what is the breakdown of the different nationalities within that working population, and then you'd be looking to understand, well, okay, what is this? What is the training? How is it conducted? In what language? And for those examples that you just described for the emergency cutoff button, well, it should be in dual language, as an example. So, or the appropriate languages for the workforce. And you're not going to get a list of 6 or 8 languages on the bottom of an emergency button, but you'd have some of the key ones, and you would expect that to cover the workforce, or certainly that part of the factory.
Can you just share a couple of other things then, Jim? I mean, because something that I actually learned myself from you was that sometimes the auditor may ask questions outside of the facility or the factory. To try and establish things. Could you just share a little bit of that so people can understand how the auditor is actually gathering their information, doing their own due diligence in terms of making an established.
So it's really important that the auditor is just not led along by the factory, and that they're able to objectively come to a conclusion of the findings that they have. So not just to take the factory manager's word for it, or not necessarily just to take the worker's word for it either. So what often we sort of do coming at different angles for a particular subject, and so in some cases where it gets a little bit more difficult, where we have a suspicion that the factory is very suspicious, operating suspiciously and not being completely honest, we would go off-site around the area of the factory and just casually talk to the vendors, those people who are selling stuff, drinks or soft snacks and whatever. As I said, we talk to security as well, but typically the vendors would be a useful point of information. Just to not to rely on as pure fact, but to give us some indication. Other things that we would do would be also things like nighttime surveillance. So we turn up our factory the night before the day of the audit and just understand, well, the lights are on, machines are humming, we can see clearly there's activity, the workers are moving in and around, and then next day we'll be talking about, well, what are your working hours, and when did you knock off, and when did you start, stuff like that. So again, it's all about the corroboration and the verification of the information as much as possible. And when we saw the divergent information, then that's when we'd be able to write it up with a high level of confidence. It's very social compliance. It's difficult to be absolutely black and white, and there are obviously ones that are straightforward, but even things like child labour can be somewhat difficult, especially if another third party is involved, like an agency. How do you get the payroll records, or the birth date of the person that you think is underage? You can go up to them and ask them for their ID card, and then they'll give you an ID card and say, yeah, that's the right age and kind of looks like the right person, but it ends up being their sister or their brother. We've had that before.
Yeah. So a very unique aspect, and many people will not be aware of this type of process, is what we call the confidential worker interview. And this is a very unique part of the social audit. And as a safety person, you wouldn't necessarily be involved in this, but you would need to have an awareness of what this is. So can you just describe the objectives of why we do these confidential worker interviews, and what the potential outcome could be in terms of any potential findings that might be identified?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of the social compliance audit is to protect the worker, which in turn protects you and protects the customer from negative media attention and from the unethical aspects of manufacturing. So this was a tool developed really early on in the startup of social compliance, the idea that we needed to be able to verify the information that was provided by the factory. They give us their time card, the payroll, all the ledgers, but we needed to understand, is it true? Is it real? So then you pick out the workers that you'd want to interview when you walk around the factory floor, put them under a little bit of pressure. So there are ways that I could talk about that in a minute, but typically you'd identify a certain number of workers and you interview on a one-by-one basis. In some cases, you'd interview them on a group basis. You'd ideally, but typically not have factory management involved, nowhere near involved, but often they'd be outside the door, just watching who's going in and maybe talking to those later. So again, one of the issues that auditors face, but it's a very specific skill set to be able to talk to workers at their level and to reassure them that they're not in danger, not at risk of losing their job, and also to talk to them at their level. But it's also, quite a broad skill set to be able to talk to them on the one hand, and then talk to factory owners on the other hand, and be able to influence them. So it's a fairly tough skill set to acquire. But fundamentally, it's really trying to get information from workers in a safe and positive way, such that you can just write up your audit report with a level of confidence.
And if you've done that, and sometimes that can be done either on site or it can be done off site, and that
typically
sometimes happen.
Certainly on site you would do that by arranging with the factory management an interview space, an office to do the interviews, or to make it less formal, and maybe even I would say suggest more effective, you go down onto the work floor and or into the canteen, and you'd be able to just talk to people and be able to get information from the workers enough to be able to validate or verify the information that you got from the factory management. So it put those workers less at risk if you were to do it on the factory floor, obviously ideally not with the production manager hovering over your shoulder, but just casually walking by and picking up different pieces of information. And again, that's another skill set to be able to ask the right questions at the right time, and whether it be one-on-one or whether it be one to several in say the canteen. Off-site, same kind of thing, really, one-on-one or one to several, but it's difficult. You can't go through a checklist. It's like a checklist of 50 questions or whatever.
No, they tried that, haven't they? They have tried that. Yeah, and it doesn't work.
And again, these are kind of snippets which get you to a conclusion. In terms of that piece of information on its own probably wouldn't hold water, but collectively, several pieces of information leading to a conclusion should be enough for a decision to be made as to whether a factory would comply or not to that particular code element.
So in terms of the findings the auditors make, I used to experience an awful lot of challenges post-audit. But if the safety professional or the individual who's fronting this audit up wishes to challenge a finding, and we can't reach, there's an impasse. We believe we're right, they believe they're right. How is that managed? Because again, this is very different from the traditional style of audit. What was the way you used to manage that, Jim?
Yeah, so the way we used to manage that was at the end of the audit process, the auditors would write up the report, write up their findings. They'd write most of them, they'd leave out a couple if it put them at risk, because there's some that are real hotspots that would trigger maybe some aggressive response from the factory management, or an inappropriate response from the factory management. And so we'd be mindful of that because it was safety first as far as the auditors were concerned. We've had cases where they've been locked in and some people have walked in and you're wondering who they are. They're all dressed in black and you think, okay, got to be careful here. We've had cases where auditors have been told to delete the photos from their cameras. And so, obviously it's clearly an audit that's gone wrong, badly wrong, for whatever reason. But typically, under a normal process, would be present the findings, talk through the findings with the factory management. There would then be a discussion, and then we allow the management to write their response to the findings, basically, and then that would go it'd be closed out, and then go for review by another team. So we were very careful to make sure that the auditors didn't have the ability to say, yes, this factory passes, or no, this factory fails. We did not want to give them that authority, because it put power in the wrong place, if you know what I mean.
Sure. So we're coming to the end of the session, Jim. And again, it's quite a complex subject, because not everybody understands what a social audit is, even though they may be receiving it. And I think this is hopefully giving some insight as to what this auditor is doing. And you may just have, as the safety person, I don't know, a 50% chunk of that auditor's time, and then they're looking at finance and they're looking at HR, etc. But from a safety professional's point of view, for them to actually understand better the issue of third-party due diligence, not doing it post-contract, what are the kind of training that they can you make any recommendations on any type of training, whether it's go and do a social systems auditor course, or witnessing them, so when you are in receipt of an audit, you've got a much better understanding of what's actually going on? Can you suggest any ideas that anyone can look at in terms of improving their skills?
So the easy one is what you've just described and mentioned, which is to hop on another audit, be an observer, be that person just shadowing an auditor who's auditing a factory. Maybe it could be an associated factory, or it could be a friendly factory, that you can arrange so that the individual can see what an auditor does. Obviously, you have to get the auditor's agreement as well, because obviously some of the things and some of the techniques that they use are quite sensitive, and what they don't want to do is give those things away. The other other option is to sign up for a course. Could be something like an SA 8000 course, which is very detailed and very thorough. But there are, I'm sure there are courses that are out there that, if you touch base with the likes of the BV or the Intertex or the SGSs, that they could organise something, or they may actually organise something that will allow people to understand, what they need to, what is a social compliance audit, and what is required of the factory from a point of view of preparation, not from a point of, but not to circumvent the actual audit, not to give them too much information that they know how to game the audit, because that's, to a lot of factories, is the problem. It's
an interesting one, because I mean, classroom learning is one thing, but I learned far more witnessing and watching other audits than any kind of classroom training, because there's so much theory.
The theory is important, very important, because and you've got to have in your own mind a framework as to how you approach it, because it's, as you said, and I'm 200% behind it, it's a very tough job. To be able to walk into a factory, converse with a factory manager who could own the factory and therefore be very influential in the local community and very, very powerful as an individual, down to the factory worker who's basically just got the shirt that they're walking around in, and try to be effective with both extremes that communicate of that society, and then you're observant the whole day. You're looking at documentation, you're looking at what's going on the ground. You're trying to identify issues. You're trying to be as positive as possible about identifying issues, in terms of, it's not there to be critical of the factory. You're there just to find the facts. What are the facts associated with that particular factory? So I'd say very difficult. The theory is fundamentally important, so you got the framework in your own mind, but the practice, having been able to paint pictures, paints 1,000 words, and so you see it and you think, wow, yes. And so we had several executives, senior executives, that would come through Asia, and we'd take them to factories so they could see clearly, what it is that presents an issue and a risk to the brand, basically, and saying, how easy it is to drop the ball, but at the same time, how challenging it is for a factory to survive and to go about its daily work.
Yeah, and I think that just to conclude, then, I mean, that's what it boils down to. This is all about, this is risk assessment in another avenue. In that, this is about protecting your brand's equity, because 9 times out of 10, if the bad stuff is happening in the tier 2s, the tier 3 suppliers, It's you as the big brand, irrelevant of what actions you've done, are going to get the negative publicity. So hopefully, I say we've reached our time, Jim, and we've only provided a very brief snapshot, but hopefully it's been useful for people to try and get an understanding of what is a very unique audit. You know, in my mind, it's one of the hardest audits to deliver, because the auditor is coming in and has knowledge on health and safety, environmental, trade unionism, HR legislation, payroll, working hours, welfare, and then still has to have the ability to interview workers. And you're expecting an individual to trust you within a very brief window of time to tell you that things are not quite right. You know, so
very tough.
It's a very, very challenging role, but hopefully when you're receiving that, you understand what the auditor is doing there, why they're trying to, no one's trying to catch anyone out, but they're just trying to find the things that could potentially cause risk to the client's business who's commissioned the audit, but also to your own business as well. So I'll pass back to Sue. Thank you for that, Jim, and I'll just pass back to Sue.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Oh, thank you ever so much, guys, for such an interesting discussion. We do have some questions. The first one, I think, has been answered a moment ago with regards to what types of specific training courses, but they're also, the attendee is also asking about what sort of qualifications for this type of auditing, and are there any particular qualifications that you would recommend?
Well, a lot of the audit companies typically will recruit graduates, but it's not automatic. You know, it's just a useful starting point. You've got to have good all-round experience. You've got to be fairly numerate. You've got to be fairly analytical. You've got to be pretty engaging, you know, with other people. So I would say if you've got good level of work experience and you're a good all-rounder, that's a very good start. And auditors will prove themselves in the field. You know, they go through some basic training, and people can see whether they can perform simply by the way they operate. We've had a lot of success by, past tense. We had a lot of success in recruiting people with a whole variety of experience, whether it be teachers or whether it be financial auditors or whether it be engineers. The arts side, less so, but that's not to say they were completely excluded. Manufacturing, absolutely. Those who knew what the manufacturing environment looked like and were able to be able to operate and be comfortable in a manufacturing environment, because it's not like an office. It's not like, you know, like there's a coffee machine or half a cup of coffee. It's the middle of it's several hours driving in the back of a dilapidated car to get to a factory in a remote location, because the labour's cheap over there, and then you've got to do your day job, and then several hours back. So you've got to have a good level of tenacity. Is what I would also say, but very, you know, typically conscientious as well, and with the right attitude.
I've just to summarise on that, there's no formal qualification. It's not like a safety qualification or an environmental qualification. The most important thing to me is experience. So this is not, so in my mind, someone a little bit older has got more to offer in many cases, because they've had greater exposure to different parts of the business. They've definitely got to have people skills. That they've got to be, you know, an auditor has got to be able to look and listen. And I've seen some very good social auditors, and I've seen some damn awful social auditors. So to me, it's about experience, but having the ability to be able to talk to people at all levels, because you could be talking to a CEO of a multi-million turnover business. You could be talking to someone who's brushing up and cleaning the toilets. It literally is as diverse as that. And you still have to be able to install a trust in them, but also, in my mind, it's from an experience point of view and qualification point of view, I think basic qualifications from an underpinning competency side is basic safety. You have to understand the basic principles of health and safety. You have to have the basic principles of HR, human rights management. You also have to have an ability to be able to read legislation and apply it in a practical sense. That's really important. So to me, I don't believe you need to have a specific qualification apart from understanding how to audit and do the lead auditor qualification. I think Jim mentioned you have to be numerate. The reason you have to be numerate is because you have to look at time cards and look at pay slips and understand how that's been calculated, especially when you work in industries where they may work variables of overtime, time and a third, time and a quarter, or they may be on piece rates and things like that. So you do have to have that understanding and then be able to also document that in an understandable way so that the recipient of your findings can actually work on it. It's not something that's written with double meanings. It's written very, very clearly so they can say, right, okay, that's what we need to do. So if it isn't done that way, what happens is the next time an auditor comes in and they find it, well, we've answered that. Because well, you haven't answered it because the problem is the original auditor hadn't written it properly. This is what we need to close out. So I don't think you need to have a degree personally. I just think you need to be a very experienced, personable person with good understanding of general business practice, but also have the ability to communicate as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and they're so valuable having these person with this all-round experience. And of course, what we're going to make sure of is that there's gender matching as well. When you're in the factory, you want to interview the workforce with 75% women, you've got to have a female auditor because it's just it works better, the engagement's better. So
absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Never thought about that, but yes.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Another question then has come in. How can we prevent a silo mentality across our teams to ensure we are all singing from the same hymn sheet in regards to the audit process?
Yeah, well, as I say, it should start from the top ideally. You know, a simple, straightforward kick up the backside message to all departments would help. But certainly a reminder to all, it's the responsibility of all employees to operate ideally in a legal manner and legitimate manner and in compliance with the rules of the company. Now, the rules of the company ideally should be based on legislation and also its own code, either code of behaviour or code of conduct from its customers. But it really does need to come from the top. If it doesn't come from the top and all it is a game for that individual, for the person who owns the enterprise to maximise his profit, then it's going to be very difficult, you know, siloed or not siloed. And typically that's when it will get siloed because I'm defending my piece, my patch, my function, and it's it's his problem or her problem. You know.
One of the things I used to do to try and remove that, because it's something that is prevalent in this type of audit, is when you do the opening meeting, I used to insist that we had representatives from safety, environment, HR, finance, operations, engineering, etc. And I made it very, very clear that you all have a part to play in this audit. This is not sitting in the lap of the safety person, not sitting in the lap of the HR person. You are all going to be participating in the audit one way or the other. And if you're not doing it personally, you'd be having to delegate someone. And I was pretty black and white and firm about that, because otherwise what tends to happen is it'll be sat with the safety person or the HR person, and that poor person will be run ragged on the day of the audit, running around trying to find you information and documentation that doesn't even sit in their wheelhouse. So they could be looking for employee files. Well, that's down to HR. So it really is important to have them in the opening meeting, so they understand that. In the closing meeting, so when you're conveying the findings, they are findings relating to the business, not to a specific department. And to Jim's point is that the top management need to understand that this is business critical, because if you don't get this right, some of your clients, because sometimes these audits and audit reports are being done on behalf of multi-clients, not a single client. So it can be either or, but you could have 7 or 8 of your clients who are accessing this report. So If you don't participate, and the auditor will record in their report if departments are not cooperative, then that will be communicated back to your clients. So the message has to come from the top, but they also have to participate and know they participate in those types of meeting scenarios. That's the way I did it, because the question really is about the culture in that company, not so much about the delivery of the audit. So we can't change the culture, but what we can do is we can help shape what we're delivering in terms of the audit and say, well, your culture may be this, but here's the reality check that you and you are going to have to work together on this, because if it isn't made available, that's how it will be reported. It was not made available. So I hope that answers the question, because we can't resolve the cultural issue, but it's if it's how I've read it, is how can we improve the interaction during the delivery of the audit. That was the option that I used to take in terms of opening and closing meetings.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And sort of a question slightly linked to that is that, Jim, you spoke about specifying standards, but how do you convince local leaders of these, and particularly, you know, the reasons why they need to adhere to these standards, particularly when they start to push back due to, say, something like cost implications?
It's always a dynamic situation. The pushback, push forward, push back, and everybody's fighting for their piece. I always see this as a consent of rings, circles that overlap into different parts, different degrees, and everybody's pulling and pushing their particular circle, standing in it and trying to get away or get closer. That's life, that's business, and that's why it's so important to get the buy-in from the top dog, the senior executives, to actually say, look, this is fundamentally important. If it's not fundamentally important, then fine, well, do your own thing, whatever. But often, you know, there is a reason why one would want to do it. Well, the customers have specified that this is what they want. Now, if they go if a manufacturing environment goes too far beyond that, then become uncompetitive. Yeah, that can happen. Don't see it very often, but it could. So they'll just continually just incrementally improve bit by bit whenever they can. And I think, okay, most brands recognize that, and that's kind of good enough, as long as the findings are not critical. So long as there are some real watertight processes, practices, and systems to prevent, say, child labor from coming in, prevent forced labor from occurring within the factory. So for the supervisors and the managers to understand, what does forced labor mean? What does involuntary labor mean? Because sure, you know, the senior management probably won't know. They just say, well, you need to understand it, make sure it doesn't happen, because that's what the customer's asking for. And often, you know, things will be found, and the factory will be in trouble, and then potentially they could be losing business because of somebody who typically didn't quite understand that they weren't supposed to do certain things, like whether it be shouting at their staff or preventing their workers on the production line from going to the toilet. But ultimately it's down to the management. You know, they have to create that environment. They have to sign off on the policies and practices that apply to their manufacturing environment. So it's to me it's very much, it's got to be those people at the top, but each tier has a responsibility, have a part to play in this, to make sure that they get things right, because otherwise they just lose the business. Ultimately, it will be down to business. You know, customers do walk away when they don't get what they want, and it's getting what they want means that their business, their reputation needs to be protected, should not be put at risk because of something that is happening on the factory floor.
Thank you. And the final question then is, what one tip can you give us to help us to prepare for an audit?
Belt up. Difficult. It's almost like a silver bullet for this. The one tip is there's more than one. First of all, you've got to know your customer. You've got to understand what their standards are, what their expectations, what their requirements are. And then ultimately, you've got to be honest, I would say. yeah, you can go so far being dishonest by cooking the books, second set of ledgers, third set of ledgers, hiding things, but you know, that costs money to do things like that. And so, you know, would it be cheaper just to be honest and recognize your own faults and saying, you know, here is our own continuous improvement plan. We're going to get there. We don't have any egregious violations or any critical violations that would put the business at risk, or that should put the business at risk, and so they should be aware of that. They should know that. But you know, it ultimately is be honest.
Yeah, I'll just add. I think from my perspective, they need to understand the code and because there'll be terminology within that code that they may be not familiar with. So then do a review of your own internal management programs from safety, welfare, HR, etc. So I would be doing a cross marriage of assessment based around what the code requires. I would have that. And if you're working to more than one code, and to be honest, Jim said early on, most of these codes are saying the same thing, but just saying it in a different way. There's only so many ways you can ask, do you use underage labor? There's only so many ways of asking that. It's like, there's only so many ways you can ask, do you have a safety policy? So I would be looking at that, but I would also be conducting our own in-house assessments. The big key area that and we're starting to see it more and more now, is as well as the social audit, the auditor is also being asked to look at the subcontractors and who the work is being subcontracted out to by the company you're auditing. So ensure that the process of due diligence around your suppliers is also cascaded to them. So it's not just done in an insular way in-house, because you can have some companies that do a fantastic job in-house, but when you go to their suppliers who may be being audited for someone else, they're not doing so well. So to me, one of the big deficits that I always used to find was the process applied to the supplier due diligence was always very, very weak. And some could say, well, what can I do about PPE sourced in Bangladesh? Well, have you asked the question? Some companies have actually gone through an ethical audit. Now, it's not to say it's going to stop or prevent these things, but the chances are lower if they have. So at least if you can say, well, look, we're sourcing this product here from Cambodia, this one here from Bangladesh, and it's being sourced via this company here, and they're using this provider here, because they've gone through a specified social audit program. Now you could have two, one that has, one that hasn't. So err on the side of caution, go with the one who has. So I would look at it in a much more holistic way and say, not just looking at what you're doing in-house, also look at what you're doing when you're as part of your sourcing program. And this comes back to the original starting point, where clients are now starting to look at the ESG and the sustainability aspects. What are the risks you get? Because every time you use a supplier, you import risk. Sometimes the risk is so big, sometimes it's yay big. So you need to understand what that level of risk is when you're purchasing that service before you start spending money, and what processes your strategic suppliers are doing when they're sourcing, because you have very little influence once you start getting below tier 1. And that's what I would do. Added to what Jim said, I would start looking also at your sourcing program and how you source companies, because that is now becoming a major issue in terms of the audit program around social and ethical sourcing.
Great advice, thank you very much. So I don't think we've got any more questions, so I think we'll leave it there. Thank you again both for sharing your knowledge with us. It's been a great session, and thank you to everybody that's joined us this afternoon. I'll put the recording of the session on the YouTube channel either later today or tomorrow, so you'll be able to catch up and recap in your own time. So we're going to end the webinar now. I hope you have a great rest of the day, and I wish you all the very best in the future. Thanks ever so much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
So thank you. Thanks, Mike.
Bye. Bye.